Hello. Over the years, there have been a great many Warhammer games in plenty of mediums besides miniatures, including card games. My guest today helped to establish Sabretooth Games, what would become a subsidiary of Games Workshop, responsible for creating WarCry, the Warhammer TCG, as well as Warhammer 40k, the trading card game, and the Horus Heresy game as well, which explored a, until then, underrepresented portion of 40k history and lore. We talk about developing mechanics for card games that bring to life the miniature battle games, as well as working with some of the finest artists in Games Workshop's portfolio, and making sure that the games themselves became collectible, interesting to play, and successful. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Ryan Miller. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. This is really exciting.
Great. I mean, I like to start these conversations just by exploring a little bit about how you got started in gaming, like as a gamer yourself. So where was what's your origin story?
The year was 1984. No, it was. So I was in middle school, and a buddy of mine says, "Hey, have you heard of this game called Dungeons and Dragons?" And I had not heard of it, which just seems crazy to think of now. But at that time, I had never heard of this game. And he starts telling me about it, but he's just kind of saying, "Oh yeah, you play these characters like knights and wizards." And my eyes are going, whoop. And he's like, "And you go into dungeons." And I'm like, whoop. And he's like, "You fight dragons and get treasure." I'm like, "Yeet." So I was so excited, and I go home. That's all I knew about the game. That's it. That was I told you what he told me, right? So that day I go home from school, and when you're a kid and you're so excited you can barely talk, and I was just like, Mom, I want to play Dungeons and Dragons. Well, this was 1984, and Dungeons and Dragons at that time had kind of a reputation, and my mom she's still alive, so is not a super religious person, but she had heard stuff on the news, so she's like, "No, you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons." I was like, oh. So I don't know where I got the idea from, but I said, you know what? I'm going to try to figure out how these games are designed. Like, all I knew was you played characters, and it was in some kind of narrative kind of thing,
Right.
And so I just really started. I had some dice from the Monopoly game in the house, and I had a pencil and a notebook, and I just started struggling through. Like, I remember having this question, like, okay, how do you know when you swing your sword at the dragon, how do you know if you hit? Because if you just ask the player, they're going to say, "Yeah, chopped its head off, done." Right? Boom, Dragon Slayer. There's got to be some system or some method that is fair, but is also satisfying, all these things. And 11 or 12-year-old Ryan is like, I don't know. And I struggled, and I was convinced. I was really, I had no frame of reference. I had no games to look at. Didn't have any D&D books. I was convinced that Dungeons & Dragons had some elegant and obvious system for how you hit the dragon. Just convinced they figured it out. And I'm sure once I see it, I'm going to be like, "Oh, of course that's how it works." But I struggled so much that I finally gave up and said to myself, "I'm just going to use dice. I'm sure D&D has some better system that is more fun and more thematic, but I'm just going to use dice." So when I found out that D&D just used dice, I was like, maybe I came to that same conclusion. Maybe I could design games. Like, it was kind of that moment for me of like, oh, maybe I have some sort of talent for this or something. And so I just started, devouring every game I could find.
Yeah.
And designing games. And so from 11 on, it was just my constant hobby. Like, I was always thinking about game designs and mechanics and ideas and worlds and all this stuff. And so that's really, how I got started as, to be a game designer. Now, of course, I didn't ever think I was going to do this like for a living. Who does that, right? No one does that, right? And I'm some kid from Southern California. I'm some Bakersfield kid, right? From Southern California who, there's no way, right? But I'm like, it's a fun hobby. I enjoy it. And maybe hopefully I'll get one published someday, right? Which I think, And I'd actually decided that I was going to be a police officer. Like that was going to be my career. So like after graduating high school, and I kind of like meandered around a bit and wasn't sure what to do. Couldn't really afford college. And I was like, law enforcement was appealing to me. I was like, this is very interesting. And I applied when I was a police department, and they didn't want me because I was a 21-year-old nobody, right? I had no experience, no knowledge. So I joined the Army. And as a military police, I got a job as military police as a corrections specialist. So I worked at Fort Leavenworth, which is the big jail that the U.S. military operates to house inmates in one of the 5 branches of the U.S. military that have committed some terrible crime. And that's, so they go. And so I did that for a couple of years. And it's a fascinating job that I never want to do again. Learned an awful lot. I have some really interesting stories that I won't go into now. But after so the reason I mention it is just when I got out of it in 1998, I'd started playing Magic: The Gathering when it came out, or within a year of it coming out, and was absolutely captivated by that game. It just blew my mind. Like the idea of building your own deck was something that was so new and interesting and novel. And then the discovery of the cards was so fast. You never knew what you were going to. Of course, nowadays you don't quite get that with trade card games, but like the discovery, the exploration of these games, you never knew. I'd open a pack and just never knew what was going to happen, right? So I've been playing that for a few years, and I knew, of course, about Wizards of the Coast. They're based in Seattle. So after I got out of the Army, I said, okay, tell you what, future Ryan, here's what I do for you. I'm going to move to Seattle. I'm going to get a job. I'm just going to try. To work for Wizards of the Coast. That way, when I'm an old man and I'm retired, I can at least look back and go, I tried. Right? So that's what I'm going to do for old man Ryan, right? I'm going to go out there, and I get there in the summer of 98 when they had just finished doing their World Championships for Magic: The Gathering out there. They used to have this huge tournament center in Seattle. It was right near Universal Washington. Beautiful 400-seat tournament area. Had a digital arcade. They had these BattleTech pods. You could do these BattleTech simulator pods. They had a retail store. They had a restaurant. It was this beautiful thing. It was awesome. And I go there, and I'm like, okay, I can judge Magic tournaments because I've been running Magic tournaments in my hometown. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to see if I can get a judge job because they need they have full-time judges at this tournament center. And that was really my first, and it was like $6 an hour, 5 to midnight, 5 nights a week. And I remember when I got the job, or I interviewed for the job, this guy named Regan, who was the hiring manager, my last job was a prison guard, right? So he's looking at my application and he's like, prison guard. I said, let me tell you about inmates. They try to bend the rules and break the rules. And if they don't like what one guard says, they go to another guard. And of course, by the time I get there, he's like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I get it. Okay, you got the job. Okay. So that was my first job. And I just talked anyone's ear off that would listen. Anybody in the company, anyone I could talk to about game design, about gamers. And then eventually at Origins, which is one of the bigger game fairs out here in the US, Origins 99, I was sent there by Wizards to help work the booth. And I met a guy named Luke Peterschmidt, who is still a dear friend of mine. He was in my wedding, as a matter of fact. And he was a brand manager at Wizards at the time. And I just went up to him because I knew his work. He'd worked on a game called Rage. He worked on, he's going to kill me. His game. We worked on Legend of the Five Rings. He had his own game a couple of his own games that he worked on. Oh, sorry, Luke. And the name of your game is just completely left my brain. Anyway, I knew his work. And so I'm like, I'm going to go talk to this guy. And I was just shameless. I was like, hey, my name's Ryan. I love games. I love the game design. And he's super nice. And we had like a 45-minute talk. And then a few months later, he called me up and basically said, you should come interview for a job with me. And that was really my big break there. So, and then it was shortly after that, a few years later, that he and I both left Wizards to start a game company called Sabretooth Games. Because a dear man named Bob Watts, who used to, that guy, you got to look at Bob Watts if you're a historian. You already know him, but he ran Raoul Partha in North America for a long time. There was, of course, the prolific miniatures gaming or miniatures producer back in the 80s and 90s. He ran, I think it was Games Workshop North America for a while too. He was a big wig with Games Workshop for a while. The man just loves toy soldiers, and he spent his whole life making games. Like, he's just the sweetest guy and just really cool. and he had acquired the rights, the trading card game rights for Warhammer 40,000,
Right.
using his connections at a Games Workshop. And so I wanted to make games. I was associate brand manager at Wizards, which is not a game design position. Really fun, very cool job, but not what I wanted to do. And so I left Wizards after about a year of being, maybe 2 years, I can't remember exactly, about a year of being at corporate, to start a company, start Sabretooth Games. And there was like 4 of us. You know, Luke came along. He and I co-designed Warhammer 40K CCG. We co-designed WarCry. Couple of other people joined us, and before we knew it, we had a company. So there you go. There was like a huge dump of information. Amazing. Right there. It took me all the way from 11 to Sabertooth. So there we go.
Well, I mean that's fascinating, though, Ryan. So I mean, it sounds then like you became a gamer and a game designer in the same moment, essentially, right?
Yeah.
At the very start of your gaming career was also the start of your design career, in a way.
100%, because it was what they, that phrase, art from adversity, right? Like, I was blocked by my mom, who had reasonable, because, you're a parent, you hear things on the news, you're like, how about don't do that thing, right? Like, it's just like, and so I was like, dang it, I really think this is interesting. And so I wanted to dig into it. And it was really that moment, I'm not bragging, but it was that moment of when I found out that D&D had come to the same conclusion I had come to. And it was that moment that kind of made me go, well, maybe I can do this. Like, these guys have been doing it for years, and I came up with not the same system, but that same concept, right? And so, preteen Ryan was impressed with himself and was like, hey, but it was that moment of like, but I also found a lot of fun in getting games. I started acquiring just we had like not a Barnes and Noble. I forget the name of the bookstore we had in town. We didn't have a game store at the time, but they had like just one bookshelf of gamery games, right? And in my, I would save up my money and I would just buy a game that was interesting. I remember buying one of my early games that you have right behind you, although I had the earlier version, was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Right.
Obviously D&D, I did end up getting, like, went to the library and got the books, and that's how I found out, and also Gary Gygax's, his verbose writing style really added to my vocabulary. I'd have the player's handbook and a dictionary, and it'd be like, anyway, but I really enjoyed kind of reverse engineering systems and just going, oh, why, I would learn a game or try to learn a game through the eyes of the designer. Go, okay, what are they trying, or what is this? What effect is this system or this rules set having on my experience as a player? And that was really a formative kind of exercise for me, really understanding what other people had done. Because once I figured out D&D came to that conclusion, I'm like, well, what other conclusions have other people come to, and how can I learn from them, right? And so that was really the start for me, and it's just a lifelong passion. To this day, I'm designing games. I'm always designing games.
I mean, is that why CCGs or TCGs, card games generally, is that why they appeal then? Because I mean, I guess compared to role-playing games, at least, they tend to be more mechanically driven, right? There's a more complex engine in many cases for a card game than there might be in an RPG.
I think there's a couple of things that appealed to me when Magic came out. I think, first of all, the 2 things that I mentioned earlier, one is making your own deck was so mind-blowing, right? The idea that, like, you think of a card game before Magic and it was like, oh, we draw from this deck that came with the game, and we're both drawing from the same deck, and like, and that was just the standard for, I don't know, thousands of years or whatever, right? It was like just the way it was, and so the idea that you could put together your own cards was like, ooh, like, I'm sure they've not thought of all of the strategies. I will find one, and so there was that interesting thing, but that leads into my kind of primary driver as a gamer, and I think as a designer, is exploring. Like, I love exploring content. I love exploring systems and finding what people have put there for me to find. I think that's really fun and fascinating. And role-playing does that very well, right? Like, the running through modules and exploring the content. I think what, for me, aside from the exploration aspect, both in, finding combos, but also opening packs and finding new powerful cards and that sort of thing, I think for me, the modularity of it, right? The preparation is all solo, right? And I had run some games, like I ran in my late teens, I ran a Vampire the Masquerade campaign for like 18 months, and I'd run some other games of my own design, that sort of thing. And so I was very familiar with the kind of the game master role and how much work and effort and blood, sweat, and tears goes into that. And so part of me was just, it was appealing that all I had to do was build my deck, show up, somebody I've never met before would get to sit down and play, right? And so it was like super simple to set up games. The community that started kind of forming around it was really fun and interesting, just meeting all these new people and that sort of thing. Whereas role playing was more like, and not in a bad way, but role play is more less about meeting new people and more about hanging out with your mates and like having a great time, which is also very valuable. But I enjoyed that other aspect of exploration of the community, right? So exploring again this theme. But mechanically, it was a challenge. Like, how do you make a system that can support cards you've never even thought of before, right? You know, things that you've never, you know, how can you do that? And then, you know, and I remember my first crack at a trading card game. I think I was, I don't know, 19-ish, 20. It was a year or two into Magic, playing Magic. And, so I must have been 20-ish, 19, 20. Anyway, I'd cut up a bunch of like index cards and I hand wrote, and the idea was like a pit fighter game. Like, okay, I'm a sword fighter and you're you know, we're just going to go at it. And I had this really neat system of like, well, I'm going to use my sword to attack. And you're like, well, I'll use my sword to parry. And look at all this stuff. And it was very fun. And the game was so long. It was so drab. And my little brother, Nate, God bless the man. He's played so many of my games, but my little brother was just like, I give up. Like this game's never going to end. And I was like, oh, and it was so hard. And so I put it away for a while. I didn't really go back into it until Luke and I started working on 40K. You know, it was really the next time I really dove into it because it is a difficult style of game to design. It's complicated, right, to get it right. And I'm not saying I've ever particularly gotten it right or 100% right, but it's like it's a difficult thing. So the challenge was neat to me. And then definitely when we got into the design of 40K, you know, especially with Luke, and the great thing is, I mean, Luke is such a great mentor. He had done it so many times already, and so it was just like I didn't have to start from zero like I did with role playing. Right, I could like, you know, throw out ideas, but still have the benefit of, you know, Luke's experience and his knowledge. I mean, the guy is just a friggin'. You should interview him sometime. He's great. So yeah, and so setting about to design 40K, that was, you know, once we had left Wizards and we were really able to sit down and just commit to it, that was just a really neat experience to work with somebody so, you know, so experienced.
Right. I mean, that must have been quite a tough moment in time, I guess. So, because obviously, you know, this is the early 2000s, right? The CCG
2001
market
is when the game launched.
There's loads of activity going on in games, in card games, right? And there's all this sorts of stuff happening. The market is kind of exploding. A lot of interest. You're co-founding a brand new company and designing your first card game, and you're not just doing that with like an original IP. You're doing that with 40K, like a pre-established, you know, very popular brand. I mean, what was that like going into that? How did that feel?
I was super excited. Like, this is what I wanted to do. Like, I was young and unattached, right? So it was kind of like I didn't have to worry about like feeding a family or something like that. I was making the best money I'd made so far in my life at Wizards. And, you know, to kind of jump that ship was, you know, I can't say it was an easy decision. It was a quick decision, right? I was like, this is what I came here to do. This is why I moved to Seattle. This is what I came here to do, right? And so, you know, once I made that call and, you know, told my boss, and he's like, you know, good luck to you and all that stuff. And then just sitting down, and then you're like, first of all, who is this for? So I played 40K, right? It wasn't like I was coming in, you know, absolutely. I was more a fan of the ancillary games. So like Man of War is I have it on my shelf back here. That's why one of the reasons I have this background. One of my favorite games of all time. Battlefield Gothic, another one of my favorite games of all time. 40K, such a blast. So, you know, we started by kind of saying, okay, what is this game about? Because one of the pitfalls, I mean, making a game based on a game is very dangerous. Because if you make a game that's too much if it's serving the emotional needs of the first game, then the gamer's gonna be like, well, I already have a game that does that. It's this game that you're making the game on. And so, you know, we early on decided, okay, what if we zoomed out and it's like, this is a planetary invasion game, right? And it's like, okay, cool. And that gave us like our first kind of foothold into what the experience would end up being. And it was fascinating because designing a trading card game, it's layers and layers and layers. Not designing any game is complicated, in my opinion. So I'm not trying to say like, oh, you board gamers or role playing game designers have it easy. They don't, right? It's not easy. I'm just saying it's more complicated because of those things. Like you have to design a system that can support cards that don't exist yet, and hopefully will exist 30 years from now. That's the goal, right? You want this like everlasting kind of game. But you also want to deliver a fun play loop, a fun experience, and I think with that game, the play experience was super fun. I think it had this really fun kind of back and forth, and we're battling on these different sectors, and like the game was four rounds, and then at the end, whoever had the most points or whatever, it was just like, and it felt like you were like landing troops in the sectors, and it had a good feeling to it, and I really enjoyed playing it. Where the thing I miscalculated with that game, I think, was that building decks for that game wasn't very fun, in my opinion. And I think that was a thing that early in my career hadn't adequately appreciated the value of having that part of the experience. So you think about a trading card game, it's really, we might quickly assume it's about playing the game. And that's just not true, right? Like playing the game is one facet of a much larger experience. You've got building decks, you've got community, right? You've got thinking about card combos, you've got collection, you've got organizing and sorting your play. There's all these different play patterns involved with a trading card game. And so when you're designing this experience, you have to think about those experiences too, right? And I think 40K, we put everything into the game design. And I think it's a really fun game to this day. I really enjoy it. But building a deck for it, it wasn't fun, I don't think, or fun enough at least, and then and I started to realize that, and I think when the Tyranids came out, which I think was the third set or fourth set, I was like, I really want to be able to build a deck that does a thing, and then I want to see it do that thing when I play it. Like that was a real, a lot of trading card gamers, like that's what they want, right? That build their own deck. And so we really started leaning into that with the third set. And we did
what was
quite
it?
a few. We had
well, like what was causing the sort of the lack of fun, I guess, in the building part of the game then? So is it just it's hard to find combos, it's difficult to assemble a sort of working engine? What sort of problems were people facing?
I think you hit on a couple of things. I think that so we had poured a lot of effort into making the cards, feel like the thing they were representing, right? If it was a unit of bloodletters, then it felt the mechanics made it feel like that. And that we call that a top-down design. We start with the theme and we design the mechanics to that, as opposed to bottom up, where we started with some mechanic and we slapped or molded a theme on top of it, right? And I think top-down is my go-to mode, because I think that resonance and immersion that it adds is one of the reasons we game, is to be immersed, right? And to like feel, and especially if you're using beloved characters, beloved, concepts and themes. As someone who loves those things, I want to feel them in the game. It's not enough for me to just see the art on the card and go, oh, okay, those are, Space Wolves, cool, right? Like it needs to feel that way, right? The problem with overemphasizing top-down design is that one of the things you do need, as you kind of touched on, is you need these kind of synergies and combos and little mini strategies within a given color or a given faction or something like that. So like if I'm playing Tyranids, I can go for the assault deck, or I can go for, like, one of the things that we did with Tyranids is they were the first faction that let you move your units out of the current battle into other sectors. So they could like spread out like bugs, right? They could just spread out and trickle out, right? And that was really neat. And so you could build this deck that did that, and it was kind of very powerful if you did it right. And that felt good, right? It felt like I made a plan. I mean, just like wargaming. I made a plan, I executed a plan, the plan worked. Man, that feels good, right? It's just a very satisfying feeling. Now, it can't always happen, right? Because if it always happened, it would be boring. It'd be like, okay, yeah, the thing I did happened. Okay, cool. But so there has to be that resistance and that difficulty, right? But that makes it sweeter when it does happen, right? It's like, it's like A-Team. I love it when a plan comes together, right? And so I don't think we thought enough about that early on, right? We were way too concerned about the orcs feeling like big, crazy, dumb, run around and blowing stuff up, Daka people, right?
Mm.
You need those, but you need that internal, like, okay, within this faction or this deck building restriction, like in 40K, it was like, seriously, it was just a faction. It's all you can have in your deck. But in Magic, for example, like the colors I've chosen, within those, there's different avenues for me to approach victory, right? And that's really important. And I didn't think enough about that in those early days of designing card sets. We started getting more designers and developers on, and then I, in my own journey, kind of started realizing that I was missing that aspect. And I'm like, oh yeah, I have not paid enough attention to this. I want to make a fun deck building experience, because players that will spend almost as much, if not more, time building decks than they do actually playing the game.
Right.
And so that has to be fun, right? I still have a notebook from when I was a prison guard, and I was super bored, and it's just lists of Magic decks. It's just like, oh, okay, I'll put 4 of these and 3 of these and blah, blah, blah. I just, from 20 some odd years ago. Because that was fun. It was playing the game, right? That's the solo mode of a trading card game. It's solo play, right? And it's just important as a designer to understand that aspect of it, right?
Yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah, I guess I never really thought about it in those terms, but you're completely right, of course, where you play the game yourself alone with your collection before you play it against someone else, right?
That's right. You're either building decks, or you're assembling your collection, or you're storing it. That's all play, right? That's all a way of playing the game. And I think that was also one of my early kind of designer realizations, because I kind of came up kind of idolizing designers, like, oh, they're really they're the rock stars of the game. And I think when I worked at Wizards of the Coast, one of the things that when I eventually came back as a game designer in R&D in 2003-ish, one of the things that they're all about is you're an experience designer. Like, you're designing an experience. And the game itself is a facet of that, right? But it's not the be-all, end-all. And just kind of understanding that. And that was also like when I was a brand manager before that. Like, brand manager is kind of it's kind of a marketing role, but it's also like, basically, I like to say it's kind of like the director of a film. And it sounds a bit aggrandizing, but it's like a director. Like, I'm not doing the acting, I'm not doing the sets or the costumes or the photography, but I'm working with all those teams to make sure we're all telling the same story.
Right.
That's what a brand manager is doing, right? Because in a complex offering, you need someone to kind of say, okay, these are all good ideas, but this is the direction we're going, right? And so so that was really helpful as a designer, right? Because then I was zoomed out and I was looking at it from a brand perspective, like, what is this experience? And that was such a helpful part of my life. Of course, that's what I do now as a brand manager, but that was such a helpful part of my kind of journey as a game designer, is to go, okay, hey, it's easy to say that a game is just the design, and that's the most important aspect. And in many ways, that's correct. But you can never, you can't discount the idea that you're part of a much bigger experience. Like, unboxing is part of the experience, right? One of my favorite examples of this is the Alien game that Ravensburger did. And when you unbox it, the back of the rulebook has just Jonesy, the cat, just going, and it's really big. But you unbox it, and there's this cat going right there. It's so great, right? It's great. But it's those types of things that you have to consider. And it doesn't necessarily mean it always has to be up to you as designers. But if you're like designing your own game, like if you're kickstarting your own game or designing your own game, you need to be thinking about those aspects of that experience, right? Because it's not just playing the game.
Sure. Yeah. So then obviously you also worked on WarCry, the Warhammer Fantasy CCG.
Yeah.
Were you able to like take any of that lesson, or the stuff you've been learning on the 40K side into that?
It was really neat. So that game, by then, I was a veteran of trading card game design, and I had a whole game under my belt. And but I was determined. I was like, okay, we had a couple of things that we really wanted to approach differently. The main one was factions. So one of the roughest parts of the 40K product itself was that it was heavily factionalized. Like, you can't mix orcs, for good reason, by the way, but you can't mix orcs and Eldar in a deck. Like, it wouldn't make any sense. People are like, what are you doing, right? The problem from a trading card game standpoint is, if I'm an orc player and I'm buying packs of random cards, then maybe 2 or 3 of the cards I get in my pack are exciting to me. right? I'm really only getting the most value out of 40K if I'm playing 3, 4, 5 different factions, right? And that's a real bummer, especially for 40K enthusiasts. They tend to have that one faction that they really love. They'll probably have a couple others. Like I was a chaos guy, I love chaos, you know, or for fantasy, I loved undead, right? And so that was my jam, right? And it was like, so we worked really hard. We talked a lot with Games Workshop on this issue itself. And so that's where we came up with like the Grand Alliance. So it was basically good guys versus bad guys. We had the Grand Alliance and the other ones. It's been 20 years.
Was it Hordes?
Thank you. So that way you could at least mix like the goodies with the goodies and the baddies with the baddies. And that one though, we did kind of zoom back in. We were like, okay, it's not one battle, but it's not a planet. So it's going to be like kind of 3 key battles you're going to play out. And it's kind of best of 2, right? Like, okay. And then we did want it to feel, we felt with that game, fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy, blocks of troops is like core to that brand. So it would be hard to do like an intrigue game where you're like the prince of a city and you're trying to like beat other cities, and people are like, this is not what I'm here for, right? Like I want my chaos dwarves, I want my Bretonians, right? Like this is I want my knights, I want my and so we actually did kind of decide to be closer to the tabletop. And it was a challenge to design that game, because obviously you need cards that represent units and characters and things like that, but you really also want cards that represent like cunning tactics and interesting items and magical spells and all these things. And that was tough, right? Because when you think about building a deck, like let's say you had, and of course WarCry, we solved this by splitting it into 2 decks. But originally it was like 1 deck, and then it was just kind of miserable because you're like, well, I didn't draw any units. I guess you win this battle. And it was like, oof, right? So we made the not easy decision of going to 2 decks. So 2 decks has a lot of its own. Because the thing about deck building is that it's a seminal experience in trading card game realm, right? It's just really, it's one of the key things that separates it from every other type of gaming. And it's not unlike building an army, right? You could say in many ways that, constructing an army in Warhammer Fantasy was the original deck building, right? It was like you were putting together these synergies and these, like that sort of thing, right? But it is a barrier to entry. If you're new, it is a very daunting task, right? And that's why like starter decks and things like those exist, right? It's like get you in, you have a deck, you can play it right away. It's not random. It's been built by the designers to be a fun deck right out of the box. That's why we do that, right? Well, now you've got to build 2 decks, right? Like now you've got to build your army deck and your tactics deck. And so that added, I really struggled with that. And I remember Luke was much more comfortable with it, and for good reason. I think it was the right call for that game. But I really struggled with it because I was worried. I was so burned by the deck building, right? I was still burned by that lack of kind of fun. And so we really worked hard to make sure that we had that. And now we had this effectively only two colors. So now it's even more important that like within the Grand Alliance, there were many different pathways to victory. And within the Horde, there was many different pathways to victory. So that not every Horde deck looked the same and not every Grand Alliance deck looked the same, right? And so, yeah, it was, but at the end of the day, it ended up being a really fun game to work on. And just, I learned so much from it. It was a blast. I really enjoyed working on WarCry.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a little bit before about working with Games Workshop themselves on sort of, how you can conquer some of the challenges that you're going to have in translating the war games into the card games. I mean, what was the working relationship like generally there for Sabertooth?
Oh my, they were so cool. I'll never forget the first time. It was like early 2001, I want to say. We flew to Nottingham to present the game design to Games Workshop. Like, here's what we're thinking for the 40K CCG. And first of all, I'd never been to England before, never been out of the country, never been out of the US before. And so it was just really neat to come. And Nottingham's a cool town. I've been there many, many times. It's a neat town. The pubs in that town are just amazing. Like, I remember one of the nights we went to the Pitcher and Piano, which is a 300-year-old church, but now it's a pub. There's a place called the Pit and the Pendulum, which is like Edgar Allan Poe themed. And of course, there's the Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem, which is reportedly the oldest pub in England. And so it's just the history there. It was just amazing. And so just going to England was great. The people are wonderful. I love England. I'll go anytime I can get the chance. So we go there, and Tom Kirby was running the company at the time. And of course, he was very interested because this trading card game thing was this new. There's a lot of potential. It was very exciting, and he was just a neat guy. I learned a lot from Tom. I remember one time he told me at that meeting. He said, "We must never forget that the rules of the game exist to allow grown men to own toy soldiers." Like it always impressed me. I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's brilliant! That is such wisdom right there." Like, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I love that." He was just a neat guy. But then I remember we were sitting down, we had the game set up, and these two guys walk up, and I look up. I've been reading White Dwarf for years at this point, and of course playing the games and stuff like that. And who do I see before me but Andy Chambers and Gav Thorpe? Just walked up to the table like, "Hey, we came to learn your game." I'm like, "Okay, here you go." Oh my gosh, it was so fun. And Andy, of course, we still talk. Andy's a great guy. I love Andy. He's a dear man. We still have once or twice a month we get on the phone or we get on Zoom and talk. He's just a neat guy. He's actually working on a miniatures game that I worked on before I got my current job. Him and Gav are working on it, which is such a trip. Like but it was just so neat, and they were so nice, and they were so helpful. They were just really great, and they really liked the concept. You could tell they were a bit like, this is weird, like trading card games. It was still kind of a new, kind of weird thing. And I think for a company, there's two ways they can go, right? One is they can go, well, we're going to go hard into how we do things, right? So you're going to do it our way. Or you can say, hey, this is an area we don't know. Help us, right? Help us understand it. We trust you. We're going to give you trust to kind of go in the way you want to go. And that's the way they did it, right? It was really, admirable, because it's scary. It's not cheap to do these things. It's not, of course, we were taking the risk, not really them, but it was still their brand, right? And so, I remember the third game I did for Sabertooth was the Lord of the Rings tradable miniatures game. And at this point in my career, I hadn't had a solo design credit yet for a published game. And God bless Luke Petersman. I told him, I said, look, I'd really love a solo credit. It's something that, for my career, I would love that. And he was like, you got it, bro. Do it. Right. And I'm like, wow, that was super nice of Luke. It was great. So then Bob Watts calls me into his office and he goes, hey, so we're going to have you go to Nottingham and consult with Rick Priestley on this game. I'm like, what? I hadn't met him yet. I hadn't met him. I don't recall, at least. I don't think I had met him on that first trip. And he was like, oh yeah, you're going to have him, you're going to work with him for, we're going to send you out there for a week. And I'm like, so first of all, I get to go to England for a week. I get to work with Rick Priestley at the Games Workshop headquarters on a new miniatures game. I was like, what? I also had a few I was a little nervous because I was worried that he was going to kind of take it over, because I didn't know the guy, right? But I couldn't have been wronger. Like, he was the sweetest guy. He'd come in with his cup of tea and we'd talk about stuff, and he'd ask me some questions about what I was working on. He'd give me some insights. He'd give me some ideas, and then he'd go do some other work. And then he'd come back in a little while. I was like, they just gave me a desk in the office there, and he was just mentoring me. And it was just so cool to get it straight from one of the legends, right? And it was just, so yeah, I know we're not talking about necessarily Lord of the Rings, but it was just it really spoke to the type of folks that were there, and it was just really neat. It was just a great experience.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds pretty amazing.
And just how did I get here? How did this happen? And I've been very fortunate that I've had many moments in my career that have forced me to go, what am I doing? What is happening? This is amazing. So yeah.
That was great.
Very lucky. Very lucky. A lot of hard work, but a lot of luck too.
One thing I was curious about in actually with WarCry and that sort of relationship was you did some expansions, one in particular, Siege of Middenheim, that tied into what was going on in the Warhammer world at the time.
Yeah, that was
Storm
cool.
of Chaos stuff, right? I was curious about how that sort of worked out, and how you timed all that up, and what sort of guidance you were being given?
Oh my gosh, I should have done some research for this interview because I would love to drop some more names of who we were working with. But I know we worked with Mark Worthington early on. I don't know if you know him. He worked mainly on 40K, and very sweet guy. But our main guy, oh my gosh, our main contact. So he was. So Andy Jones did work with us a bit too. I could see the man's face and I could smell the cigarette smoke because he was a prolific smoker. But other than that, so they were doing a very good job of making sure that their brand was well represented in like the art, because we were also like, we were working with freelance artists. So, like 40K CCG was the first time Games Workshop allowed non-Games Workshop artists to do art for one of their games. Right? It was the first time they did that. And of course we had to, because you need hundreds of artists to do a trading card game. You can't rely on a small handful because it is just trading card games. You need every 3 or 4 months, you're coming out with a few more hundred cards. All of them need art, right? So it's a constant, beast that is just chugging art, right? So, so that was kind of a new process for them to make sure that that the art was on par. And of course, we worked with some amazing art directors in house, and then those art directors worked with just an amazing crop of artists that just were super excited because they're like, I've always wanted to do Warhammer fantasy art and never got able to. I've never been able to do this because you have to work in house, and now I can do it. So they were hungry, they were excited and enthusiastic, right? And that's just a great recipe for some great art. And I think the art for that game was just outstanding. But then when it came to like event stuff, that was something that we had been talking about and kind of asking for a while. And it's not easy, right? Because the timelines of preparation are different depending on the different types of product. And so it's kind of like, like the term D-Day, how that came to be back in World War One. It was originally called J-Day because it was French. But the idea was so many different elements had to line up on one moment. You had artillery, and you had air support, and you had infantry, and you had the budding armor corps that was barely there yet, and you had all these things, supply, all these things had to line up, and they all had different tales that led up to this. And so they would say, so D-Day was just a way of saying, D-Day is when it's going to happen. We don't know when that's going to be, right? D-Day could be November 11th. It could be January 1st. We don't know. But that way I can say, well, D-5, I need to start my supply chain or whatever, right? I need to do that. So it's a similar thing with something like this. We know, at least in this case, we knew like, okay, this promotion was going to be happening that summer. So, but we had to know well in advance because making a card set, it takes a long time, getting all the art done and approved and then, getting it, all that stuff. And so it was a lot of coordination with Games Workshop, and they were, of course, really great. It was just really neat to see. Now, whether or not it was effective with the audience, that's another question, right? Because, who in our audience was playing both games, right, actively? That was the person who's going to get the most out of that, I think, right? But the cool thing is, even if you weren't playing the minis game at the time, let's say you were playing our game because you always kind of thought it was cool, but you maybe didn't want to invest in the time or the money to get a whole army going, but this is your way to kind of participate. Or maybe you did all that, but you don't have anybody local that plays it, so this is your way to kind of get that fix, that kind of thing. That was neat for them too, because they could feel like, okay, they were still a part of that, right? Even though they weren't going to the store and rolling dice and moving models, they were still kind of a part of that. And it was something like every game I've done that is a licensed product is something we always strive for. It's not always attainable, but to kind of be a part of a bigger thing with a brand, I think always makes us feel like we're in the club, right? And it's just really fun because you are. You literally are. So pretty fun. It was neat to work on. And also just as a gamer, I was like, ooh, I get inside information. Ooh, you feel like you're behind the veil of secrecy, and you're like, ooh, this is what's happening, and I know, and you don't know, but I know. It was because I remember I got an early. So I was playing Battlefield Gothic pretty heavily back then, and there was this amazing model called the Chaos Planet Killer. It was this beautiful friggin' model, and it wasn't out yet. And because I worked at Games Workshop, I worked at Sabertooth, I was able to get like advanced, and I was just like, like it was like, oh, that was so cool. Oh my, it was so great.
Amazing. Do you just whilst we're on it, do you remember how early you were starting work on that Siege of Middenheim stuff? Was it a year ahead? Was it 6 months?
I could guess because it was probably in the 18-month range.
Right, that far.
Yeah, because you've got several pieces that are coming together. What did Gandalf say? The pieces are on the board and moving, whatever. So you've got the game design itself, right? And the game design of a trading card game, especially one that's up and running, has a bunch of sets already out, isn't just about the cards in that set, right? You have to know what came before. You have to kind of have an eye of where you're going. You have to know where that set does on its own, because every set is somebody's first set, right? But you also have to know how that set fits into everything that came before it, right? So your designers and developers have to be, really like, when you hire somebody, there's that spool up time, right? That time it takes for them to go from 0% to at least 90% of contributing, right? But hopefully 100 or more. Spool up time for a developer and designer on a trading card game is one of the longest I've seen in my career, because they have to get up to speed on everything that's come before them. They have to have this period where they're going to design a bunch of cards and have, it's like the what is it, South Park? It was like Simpsons did it. Like, that card's already been done. Oh, we did that 2 years ago. Oh, so you have that aspect of it. You have the design itself that's kind of tinkering together, and ideally that design, the game design, is heavily meshed with the story, right? As much as possible. So we talk about that top-down stuff, right? It's really important. So I seem to recall, and I could be wrong here, but I seem to recall that we were actually working on this before we knew about this promotion from Games Workshop. And so when they started talking to us, we had to pivot the game design to kind of fit in that new theme, because we saw, of course, this great opportunity to participate in that part of the brand. And we saw this, obviously very important to make it feel like this is one big experience, right? And that's what Games Workshop was going for. They wanted this one global, this big experience. It was really neat, right? And so we had to pivot some of the game design. Now, some of it, because cards are a bit abstract in their execution and their mechanics, you can kind of hand wave a little bit. Like, oh, this used to be a bunch of guys on cavalry, but it's a handful of demons, and we'll just kind of like, that sort of thing. You can kind of do some of that, but whenever you have to redesign, now you have to do that whole thing again. Okay, how do the redesigns fit in with what's before? How do they fit in with the current set? How do they fit with where we're going? And so it's a pretty complex process. And then, of course, art is the other thing, because when you're doing art on a licensed product, it's not like Pokemon or Magic where you own the property, so there's still approvals, but they're like in-house, right? When you don't own the property, the approvals, there's several stages, right? You got the sketch, and it's like, here's the sketch, right? Okay, cool. And we send it off to Games Workshop. They're like, here's our feedback, or go to color, and then we do color. Okay, what do you think? And they go, make these changes, blah, blah, blah. There were times when like John Blanche was like looking at our stuff and giving us feedback. I'm like, sweet. It was just really cool. I'm like, oh yeah, I met him once or twice, and it was like meeting an ancient artificer. Like, literally, the way he had an aura, the way he moved, the way he talked, you were just like, you were in the presence of something more than human. It was just really fascinating. The guy, it was just like, now, of course, a lot of it was my own, because I'd known his work for so long, and his work is so formative in so much of Games Workshop. You could say almost all of it. It's just part of the DNA. But also the man, just the way, anyway, I'm name dropping like crazy here. So there's that whole art process, and then there's production. And production for a set, once you've got it up and running, you're looking at maybe 3 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the product, right? And you're working with a printer. We worked with a company called Cartamundi, who was like they were the first ones that print Magic cards, for example. So they kind of had been doing it a long time by then. And so really, it's just all these pieces leading up to D-Day, right? And so it's just really, and then you got to have that flexibility in there to like pivot, like we had to do with design, But really, it starts with that top line. What is the set about? Okay, let's design some cards. While we're doing that, we're starting the art process up, and at some point design goes into development, which is playtesting and all that. But art is kind of going hopefully concurrent with all that. So it's a really big beast, right? And so to line up with the thing, that's why I say we try to do that, right? We try to line up with things that are happening. Doesn't always work for lots of different reasons, right? Especially in a licensed product.
Right. I mean, just thinking about that the practicalities that you sort of mentioned about the design perspective of having to bear in mind almost every card that's come before, and where things could potentially go in the future. I mean, that's a lot of information to keep in your head as a designer when you're trying to write 150 cards or 200 cards for an expansion set. So like how like that feels like it would be a really difficult task to actually do that.
I think the first key is you have to play your game. Like you have to be a player. You can't just play your game. You have to be a player of your game, and that means that you're building decks. You're like going to locals and like playing with people. And so because a player, an average player trading card game, especially a competitive one, they're going to know that stuff already. Like they're going to know everything that's come before it. They've gone through it. They're going to know the themes and mechanics that tend to be very powerful, that sort of thing. And so you kind of have to be that too, right? But and part of it though is also kind of letting go of that. Sometimes you're like, okay, I know we've kind of done this before, but I'm trying something, right? Because a lot of design's job is to put some stuff on the canvas, and development is the one that starts shading it and starts kind of whatever, and sometimes erasing and redoing things. But like that's you got to be willing to kind of go like, I know this is, we're going in this direction. Like this is what we're doing. We're gonna kind of fix it later, but this is kind of the direction we're going. So you kind of have to hold a lot of that. When it comes to future stuff, your main concern is what you don't want to do is make cards or abilities that block future designs. So, one of the things we talk about is the design space of a card game. And so the design space is simply, you've got a system at the center of it. The design space is simply everything that system will allow a card to do, everything, right? So a card can give plus strength to cards. A card can draw you more cards. A card can make other people discard cards. Like there's all these different things, right? The design space. And for a card game that you want to last for as long as it can last, ideally you want that design space to be very large. And there's design space, which is everything a card can do, and then there's usable design space, right, which is generally pretty smaller, right? There's design space that says, chosen character becomes a ninja. Well, what the hell does that mean? Like that's not super usable, right? But chosen character gets plus strength. Okay, yeah, that's a widely applicable thing. We can, it gets all this stuff, right? And so, what you don't want to do is design a card that will make you have to think about that card every time you design new games. So let me get a terrible example. Let me think of a terrible example of this. And these are where the game breakers kind of come into sometimes. But let's say, well, here's a terrible example. But let's say it's a card that says every time you play a dwarf, draw a card. So this is not an example of a card that like breaks the game in the future, but this is a card that you have to think about every time you make a dwarf, right? You're like, okay, every time I make a dwarf now, I got to think about this card. And is that okay? Now, in this case, it's probably fine, right? But that's why I say it's a terrible example, but it's an example nonetheless of like, this is a card that affects future designs, right? Because it's gonna go down the road and go, okay, now we've got to think about this every time we make a card that does X. Whenever you attack with the character, deal 3 damage to an opponent. And it's like, okay, well, attacking with the character is pretty common. You got to think about these different interactions and how they could affect future games. And then, and inevitably, you're going to think of a bunch that will, and then you got to decide if you're okay with it, right? And most of the time, you're like, sure. But sometimes you're like, oh, that's going to block us from ever doing X. So maybe we may not ever want to do X, but we understand that that's a cost of doing this card, right? And so we have to be careful of that. So that's really what it is. But then the other thing is you tend to have a roadmap of sets. Like, okay, next set we're going to introduce cavalry. Okay, so we know that going into the current set of design, that next set's going to have cavalry, and cavalry is really good at outmaneuvering, whatever that means for your game, right? So any card in this set that relies on outmaneuvering, might be worse in the next set, or might be drastically better. And you just have to be thinking about those kinds of things, right? You're like, thinking about the effects of what you're doing based on the roadmap that you're going. So,
right. Yeah, that makes sense.
There's my story with some not great examples because it's kind of early in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I guess, so I suppose, just sort of bringing the sort of Sabertooth story to a close. I mean, do you recall like how did those games perform in the market? Like, were they successful? Did they do really well, or were there sort of like issues with any of that sort of stuff?
So they did for their time. I think pretty well. They lasted fairly long. Most games didn't last a year, right? I mean, it was really, or even more than 2 sets, right? There were so many coming and going that really, so to have multiple years was, and to this day, that's, it's most trading card games don't last a year, right? And so I think like 40K, I think did very well. but began to buckle under the weight of factionalization. I think that was really the thing that was the more factions we added, which was a demand of the audience. They wanted they wanted their factions, they wanted their Tyranids, they wanted their Imperial Guard, and I wanted to give it to them, right? But we knew that every time we did that, we either had to take a faction out of that set, which means now if you're a Space Marine player, of course we'd never take Space Marines out, but if you're a Dark Eldar player, and we don't put Dark Eldar in a set, then you're just not going to buy it, and I wouldn't blame you, right? But we also needed to keep adding sets. Now, adding faction. Now, one of the things we did, of course, was like sub factions. So we added chapters for Space Marines and Chaos and stuff like that, so that you could still have some non-Space Wolves in your deck, but you're still playing a legal deck, that sort of thing. But that was just a band-aid on a bigger problem that was really from the start, something that we couldn't get around because that's just 40K, right? And so what we did with that was we did the Horus Heresy. So we rebranded and relaunched the game as the Horus Heresy. And that was basically zooming in on, of course, a piece of the 40K history that at that point had not been explored a lot. And so it was fascinating from that standpoint. I think there were a lot of issues with that direction. Now, one of the things it did do is it was the prototype for the WarCry system of good versus evil, right? It had the heretics and it had the Space Marines. So now your booster packs are more valuable to you, right? We also had a healthy amount of generic cards in there, so either side could use them, which we also did for WarCry. So your booster packs are more valuable to you. Unfortunately, though, that meant that if you're an orc player, well, okay, the orcs for you. And there were quite a lot of folks who were pretty upset with us, and I don't blame them, right? But we were basically like, well, it's either this or we don't do any more cards, right? And this was a lot of times you're in a game, you're in a product, and you're making the best call you can with the information you have, right? Is it the right call? Hopefully, is it the perfect call? Almost never, right? Like it's just not the way it is, right? You just make the best call you have based on what you know and what you're feeling about the game, right? And so we did that, and that gave us a couple more years, I think, with 40K. They did eventually start adding in the factions again. I remember this was after I had left the company. They started adding in the factions and such, and that kind of gave it more life. So, and we launched WarCry, and WarCry had a great launch. And it had its own. It had quite a few sets, right? It really. So for its time, and I would even say for today, we would consider it a successful game because it lasted longer than 90% of games ever got to last. I think the I don't want to go be as dramatic as to call it a fatal flaw, but I think the biggest issue with both games was the audience, right? And what I mean by that is not that. What I mean by that is you have a Venn diagram of trading card gamers and say Warhammer Fantasy fans, right? And there is overlap, right? And so we would get the overlap really great. Like they were our core audience. They loved they loved TCGs and they loved Warhammer Fantasy, and it was like we made the game for them, right? But in order to be a long-term successful game, we had to make inroads into those other sides of the Venn diagram, the parts that don't overlap. We had to. It's important, right? Well, the problem is, from a basic standpoint, if you're a Warhammer Fantasy player and you see this game, you're like, oh, hey, that's for trading card gamers. Isn't that great? They can now enjoy this world that I love. And trading card gamers are like, oh, that's for the Warhammer Fantasy players. Isn't that nice? They can enjoy trading card games now, right? Each of them thought it was for the other, right? Yeah. And so fundamentally, we just weren't. I mean, there were other issues too, but fundamentally, we weren't able to get enough of an audience to sustain the long-term growth of the game, and that's just the bottom line, right? It was just one of those like, the people we did get, we have great fans to this day. There's fans of those games that still play and build decks and make their own cards and stuff. And it's just amazing to see that. It's amazing to know that I've been a part of an experience that is to this day still making smiles out in the world, right? It's just wonderful. But at the time, it's a business as well, right? And we have people's salaries to think of. And we have all these other things. And so, so that, and that was one of the reasons I left is because Games Workshop actually purchased Sabertooth in I think 2003-ish, something like that. And they, at the time, were kind of trying to centralize their North American operations in Memphis. And so they were like, hey, we're moving Sabertooth to Memphis. Do you want to move? And I just didn't. I love Seattle. I loved it. I had roots here. I had friends here, that sort of thing. And I was like, I think I want to stay in Seattle. And plus, I had this other goal of like, now that I had this experience, I've launched 3 games. I basically, at that point, sent an email to Bill Rose, who at the time was VP of R&D for Wizards, and I said, "Hey, you should hire me now." So I've done it. I've done it now. Last time you talked to me, I didn't know anything about this, and now I've done it 3 times. So like, let's talk. And so eventually, after a few months and a bunch of interviews, I finally, about 7 years after I moved to Seattle, I got the job that I came to Seattle to get, which was game designer at Wizards of the Coast. But that's why I left. But after I left, they kept pushing along with Horus Heresy and WarCry, and it's amazing. I think really impressive that they were able to continue as long as they did. It was something I've always been been proud to be a part of. It was a really fun experience. We made a lot of great friends. We made a lot of fun experiences for people. And at the end of the day is why I do this. I love putting smiles on people's faces. I love, and tabletop gaming does this so well. The connections it creates, the memories you make, tabletop gaming are just so wonderful. And to be a part of something that makes that stuff happen is about the most fulfilling thing I could think of, right? It's just like, I'm not like a heart surgeon or something like that, but like I get to be a part of a thing that brings people together and helps them make memories with their friends and family. I think, man, it doesn't get much better than that for me, right? I always like to say it's like making games is that the feeling of making games is that feeling you get when you bought someone a present and you can't wait for them to open it. Yeah. When you're excited, you hope they like it, you think they will, and you can't wait for them to open it and start enjoying it, right? That's what the feeling of making games is, right? And that's what's kept me in tabletop is that community and that feeling of like making memories with friends and family. It's just wonderful.
That's lovely. Yeah, what a wonderful way to look at it. And I think a lot of people would agree. You've absolutely done that, Ryan. So yeah,
thank you so much, Jordan. That's very nice of you.
Well, thank you as well for joining me and chatting to me about some really fun
this is fun. Yeah, I don't get to talk about this stuff very much. This is so long ago. So it was just when you reached out to me, I was like, oh, that sounds like fun. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that part of my life and those games. It was such a wonderful experience. So thanks for having me. This is really neat. And thanks for doing what you do. I mean, the history of gaming is such a fun and interesting thing. And people like you are kind of keeping it alive. So I appreciate you, man.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ryan. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining me to talk about so many interesting facets of WarCry and Sabertooth history. It was really super interesting, and I am very appreciative. If you would like to support the work that I do here, please consider checking out my Patreon. You'll get early and exclusive access to content, regular updates, a Discord server, monthly giveaways, and, of course, my eternal gratitude. Don't forget that you can listen to my interviews as a podcast. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods, and you should be able to find it. Thank you once again to Ryan. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.